Jake Carson, a lone freight driver on the empty highways of the desert, never expected to find himself at the heart of an ancient mystery. When an unexpected storm forced him to shelter a family, he uncovered the haunting remnants of a lost caravan, their dark past tied to a struggle for survival in the very land they were now trapped in. But just as the pieces of history began to fall into place, Jake realized that his role in this unfolding tale was far more significant than he ever imagined. This is the gripping story of how one man's unexpected act of kindness turned into a battle for redemption, and why, in the end, justice triumphed in ways no one could have predicted. Jake Carson had been driving these highways for years, and the stretch of desert outside Tucson was one he knew like the back of his hand. Endless, empty roads, brown earth stretching beneath the relentless sun. The horizon blurred into a hazy line where the heat from the pavement danced in the air. He was used to the isolation, the quiet hum of the engine, and the occasional flash of wildlife, lizards darting across the road, hawks circling high above. This was his world, but tonight felt different. The sky, usually clear and wide, was slowly darkening in the distance, a slate-gray wall of clouds gathering as though something was brewing deep in the desert's bones. At first it seemed like nothing more than a passing shadow, just another storm. But then came the wind. It picked up with a force that rattled the truck, pushing against it like a living thing. Dust from the dry earth swirled in the air, a thick fog of sand that blurred the edges of the road. Jake squinted against it, trying to make sense of the path ahead. His truck groaned under the strain as the tires bit into the shifting earth. The road was starting to vanish beneath the dust, and the headlights of his rig barely cut through the swirling storm. The air had turned heavy, thick with an electric tension that prickled his skin. He checked the weather radio, but it was static, a crackling mess of noise and broken signals. No help there. It was then that he saw the headlights ahead, a faint glow in the distance, faint but real. His instincts kicked in. This was no time to be out here alone, not with this storm coming down on him. He jerked the wheel, guiding his rig off the road, tires skidding on the loose sand. The truck jolted to a stop, and he threw it into park, heart thudding in his chest. The wind howled, a low, eerie moan, as if the desert itself was warning him. He cut the engine and stepped out, the air biting at his skin like 1,000 tiny needles. In the growing dusk, he saw it, a small cabin tucked away against the rocky rise of a distant hill. It looked abandoned at first glance, weathered wood, half-collapsed porch, the windows dark and lifeless. A shiver ran down his spine, but he was too far gone to turn back now. The storm was picking up speed, and he couldn't stay out in it any longer. The cabin was his only chance for shelter. Jake pushed open the creaky door and ducked inside, his boots scraping against the old wooden floorboards. He pulled the door shut with a thud, muffling the roar of the storm outside. Inside, it was cooler, the stale air thick with the smell of dust and age. The walls groaned in protest, the structure settling under the weight of the storm. Jake wiped the sweat from his brow, his nerves still tight, his breath coming in shallow bursts. The wind outside screamed louder now, a deafening force battering against the fragile building. He couldn't see the dust anymore. Everything was gray, as though the world itself had been swallowed by the storm. Through the cracks in the door and windows, the dust poured in, swirling like a living fog, filling every corner. Jake leaned back against the wall, staring at the ceiling, trying to steady his breathing. He had no idea how long the storm would last. Hours? Maybe? More? But for now, all he could do was wait, and hope the little cabin could hold together long enough to get through this. The world outside was nothing but a blur, a wild, chaotic mess of wind, dust, and darkness. But here, in the silence of the shack, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Something he couldn't yet see, but could feel deep in his gut. The storm wasn't just the end of the road. It was only the beginning. Jake's hand paused on the doorframe, his eyes adjusting to the dim light inside the cabin. For a moment, he thought the shadows were playing tricks on him, just the wind rattling the shutters, or his own mind stretched thin by the storm. But no. There, sitting against the far wall, were figures. People. At first glance they seemed like mirages, like the storm itself had conjured them up. But as his eyes sharpened, he saw them clearly. An older man, hunched slightly, his clothes weathered and worn, sat with his back against the wall. Beside him was a woman, holding tightly onto the hands of two young children. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide, filled with an exhaustion that spoke of hours spent waiting, of fear pressed deep into their bones. The faintest hint of desperation clung to them, visible even in the dim light. Jake took a step forward, his boots scraping the wooden floor with a sound that seemed impossibly loud. The older man looked up, his eyes narrowed against the dimness, then widened in recognition, as if Jake was the first bit of life they'd seen in what felt like an eternity. His voice cracked when he spoke, a rasp like dry paper. We didn't think anyone would come. Thought we were alone out here." Jake's heart softened. It had been a while since he'd encountered anyone else on these roads, and his gut twisted at the sight of this small family, stuck, stranded, and vulnerable. Their car had obviously broken down, the remains of it parked just outside, where Jake had seen the faint flicker of headlights before pulling off the road. He took another step, scanning the room quickly. The walls were bare, save for some old shelves that seemed to sag under the weight of forgotten things. There was a small table in the center of the room, a few chairs scattered around it, but it was the people who drew his attention. The storm outside was screaming like an animal, clawing at the cabin walls, rattling the windows. Jake could hear the wind tearing through the cracks, the dust whirling in endless spirals, choking out everything beyond a few feet. It was impossible to see the road from here, impossible to even think about driving through that mess. Jake cleared his throat, taking a slow breath to steady himself. "You folks all right?" he asked, his voice rough from the dry air. His first instinct was to offer what he could: water, blankets, food. His truck had supplies, and if he could help them weather the storm, he would. But the more he thought about it, the more the gravity of the situation sank in. The storm wasn't just a passing inconvenience. It was a beast, relentless and unforgiving. Even if they could somehow get the car started, if the engine hadn't been too damaged, there was no way they would make it out before morning. Not in this. The woman spoke then, her voice low but filled with gratitude. "We've been here for hours. We were hoping the storm would let up, but it's only gotten worse." Jake nodded. The wind was howling like a freight train now, tearing through the air with a ferocity he hadn't expected. He could feel it in his bones. The storm wasn't letting go. Not tonight. He looked down at the children. Their wide eyes were still full of fear, but there was a quiet hope there too, the kind that flickered faintly when someone unexpected showed up. The boy, maybe 7, clutched a small toy in his hand. The girl, no older than 5, was curled up against her mother, her face pale, but her grip on her mother's hand firm. Jake could sense the family's unease, their worry. They had no choice but to wait. No choice but to stay put until the storm passed. But there was no way they'd make it through the night without help. "Listen," Jake said, his voice steadying. "I've got food and water in my truck, blankets too. We'll hunker down here until the storm dies down. Don't worry about the car for now. We'll figure it out later." The older man's face softened, relief washing over him. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, as though he couldn't quite believe someone had come to their aid. "We didn't know what we were going to do." Jake nodded, a quiet promise in his tone. "We'll make it through, just gotta hold tight." He turned, walking back to the door and pulling it open just enough to squeeze out into the maelstrom outside. The wind nearly knocked him off his feet, and the dust hit him in sharp, painful stabs. His truck was just a few yards away, but it felt like miles as he fought against the storm. He grabbed a couple of heavy blankets and a few bottles of water, holding them tightly against the wind as he trudged back to the cabin. When he returned, the family was still there, huddled together, the storm pressing in from all sides. The air inside the cabin felt thick with tension, but there was something else too, something hopeful. even if it was faint. The storm had come out of nowhere, but now Jake knew they weren't facing it alone. It was them against the desert, and they were going to make it through. The storm had passed, but its aftermath lingered, like the taste of something bitter you couldn't quite shake. Jake had slept fitfully, tossing and turning on the creaky cabin floor, his mind racing through fragments of the night. The wind had howled relentlessly, but now, as the first faint light of dawn spilled through the small cracks in the cabin, the world outside seemed eerily still. Jake stood up slowly, his stiff joints protesting the movement as he stretched his arms. He stepped over the sleeping figures of the family, their exhaustion palpable, and crept toward the door. The air had a cool bite to it now, but the remnants of the storm still clung to the landscape, a heavy fog hanging in the air. When he opened the door and stepped outside, the world was wide open, the vast desert stretching endlessly before him. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the dry, crisp air, and began to walk, determined to assess the damage. The remnants of the storm were scattered across the land, broken branches, twisted metal, dust that still hung like a cloud, but what he saw next made his heart skip a beat. The ground was marked with tracks, footprints, wagon marks, deep ruts etched into the dust that hadn't been there before. They stretched as far as he could see, weaving through the desert like some forgotten, ghostly procession. The tracks were unlike anything he had seen before. There were no signs of modern vehicles, no tire marks. Instead, the shapes were angular, uneven, rough, like the ghostly traces of wagons that hadn't been used in a century. Jake squatted, his eyes narrowing as he inspected the markings. It was as though the storm had uncovered something buried deep in the desert, something long forgotten. The wind had swept away the layers of time, revealing an ancient trail. His mind raced. It looked like the remnants of a caravan, but not one that had passed recently. No, these tracks were older, much older. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he slowly turned his head, scanning the desert horizon. It was as if the past had come alive, the desert revealing a story that had been buried for generations. The ghostly outlines of a convoy, one that had traveled through this barren land long ago, now sat before him in stark clarity. It was then that he heard the voice. The old man, the one who had been with the woman and the children, stepped out of the cabin behind him, his weathered face drawn tight in a frown. He'd been quiet all night, watching the storm through the small cabin window with a distant, almost haunted look in his eyes. Now, though, he seemed different. There was something else in his gaze, something that made Jake pause. "You see it too," the old man said, his voice quiet but steady. There was no question in his tone, only a resigned certainty. Jake stood up slowly, dusting his hands off. "What is this? What happened here?" The old man's eyes lingered on the tracks, his weathered hand reaching up to touch the brim of his worn hat. This is the Wagon Army. My ancestors. A caravan that passed through here many years ago, when the land was still young. They were settlers, pioneers, who fought their way through this desert, searching for a place to call home. Jake turned to him, confusion crossing his face. "You mean they're all gone now, right? This was centuries ago?" The old man nodded, but there was a faraway look in his eyes, as if he were seeing something Jake couldn't. "Not gone. Survived. This land doesn't forget its own. No." You see, the storm uncovered what had been buried, just like it always does. His voice dropped lower, almost a whisper. "They came here to settle, to build, but it wasn't just the land that tested them. There were things out here that the land tried to hide. They fought, struggled, and some of them made it. Others—" His voice trailed off as he glanced down at the tracks. "Others were lost." Jake didn't know what to say. The air seemed heavier now, the weight of the old man's words hanging between them. The convoy, the Wagon Army, hadn't just been a group of settlers. They had been survivors, fighters, people who had lived and died in these very sands, leaving their mark in ways that would never fade. "Do you," Jake began, his voice tight, "do you think your family, your people, are still connected to this?" The old man smiled faintly, his eyes reflecting the harshness of the desert. "My blood runs with theirs. They've always been a part of me, even if I didn't know it at first. There's something about the land here. The storm, it brought it back. This is where we came from, and this is where we belong." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. There was something ancient about what the old man was saying, something that went beyond history. It was as if the land itself held memories, as if it had the power to bring the past to life when it chose. The old man stepped forward, looking out at the tracks. "You've helped us, son. I don't know why, but you did. We were lost, stranded, and you gave us shelter when we needed it most. You're part of the story now, too, whether you like it or not." Jake looked back at the tracks, the trail that stretched endlessly through the desert. The morning sun was rising higher, casting long shadows across the earth. The storm had cleared, but something else had been revealed. A hidden history, a forgotten army, and somehow he had become part of it. The old man's voice broke through his thoughts. "You'll understand more as the day goes on, but right now we need to keep moving. The desert's not done with us yet." And with that, the old man turned and began walking toward the cabin, his family following close behind as the desert stretched endlessly before them, still waiting, still holding its secrets. The family left at dawn. The old man, his eyes still carrying the shadows of long-lost memories, had helped his wife and children into their car. Miraculously, it started with a sputter, the engine grinding as if reluctant to come back to life after so many hours of silence. They exchanged quiet words, their voices almost drowned out by the soft hum of the engine. As the car rolled away, Jake stood still, watching them disappear into the desert, the fading exhaust a final trace of their brief presence. Jake remained where he was, standing in the middle of the barren landscape, the sun rising higher with every passing moment. The storm had cleared, leaving only the eerie silence of the desert in its wake. The wind had calmed, but there was a heaviness in the air, like the land itself was waiting, watching, knowing what had passed between them. The tracks of the wagon army, now faint and less distinct in the morning light, still haunted his thoughts. He'd given them shelter, yes, but it had been more than that. He had provided them with something else, something intangible, something that he hadn't expected. He had handed them a piece of the past, a connection to the forgotten struggles of those who came before. The remnants of that caravan, those haunting tracks that had appeared as if summoned by the storm, were more than a simple relic of history. They were a reminder that survival was never without its cost. Jake had known hardship. Long hours on the road, the loneliness of the endless highways, the sting of a hard life spent in isolation. But helping that family, sheltering them from the storm, had cost him something more. It wasn't just the inconvenience of his discomfort or the quiet solitude he had grown used to. It was the weight of history that now seemed to press down on his chest. The discovery of the convoy's remains, the ghostly traces of an army long forgotten, had changed the landscape of his life in ways he couldn't quite articulate. The old man's words echoed in Jake's mind, as clear as if they had been spoken just moments ago. "You're part of the story now, too, whether you like it or not." There was no going back now. He wasn't just a freight driver anymore. He had touched something deeper, something older. A story older than the land itself, a struggle that had been fought with blood, sweat, and tears in the face of impossible odds. And somehow, Jake had become a part of it. He thought of his own road ahead, the truck, the long stretches of empty highway, the endless cycle of loading and unloading. It all seemed different now. Those roads, which had once been a comfort, a predictable path he knew well, now felt uncertain. The storm had passed, yes, but what came after the storm? What did the future hold when you had seen the past in such vivid, haunting detail? Jake ran a hand over his face, the exhaustion of the night still clinging to him. His mind felt foggy, caught between the lingering weight of the family's gratitude and the deeper, more troubling realization that his life had irrevocably changed. He wasn't just a bystander anymore. He wasn't just a man passing through the desert, a nameless face on an endless road. No, he was something more now, a keeper of stories, a witness to history. The silence of the desert enveloped him, broken only by the faint rustling of the wind. The land stretched out before him, vast and empty, yet full of secrets. Jake felt the enormity of it all. The cost of heroism, he realized, wasn't always measured in what you gave up. Sometimes it was in what you inherited, what you carried with you long after the moment had passed. The burden of history, the weight of unseen sacrifices, and the knowledge that survival often came at a steep price. He sighed, a deep, weary sound, and turned back toward his truck. The sun was higher now, casting long shadows across the sand. The day was unfolding, and with it a new chapter of his life was beginning, whether he was ready or not. The road ahead was uncertain, but that wasn't something he could change. What mattered now was how he would carry this weight, how he would walk forward with the knowledge of what he had seen, what he had touched, and what he had become. Jake climbed into the cab of his truck and started the engine. The rumble of the diesel motor felt familiar, comforting even, but the road ahead felt different. The sun, now climbing higher in the sky, cast a golden light over the desert, but Jake knew that some shadows were deeper than the ones cast by the setting sun. He had given the family shelter, but the price had been much higher than just his time and comfort. The storm had passed, but the echoes of the past, those whispers of survival, of struggle, of history, would stay with him forever. As he pulled onto the road, his heart heavy with the weight of the desert's secrets, Jake knew one thing for certain. He could never go back to the way things had been. The cost of being a hero wasn't just in the sacrifice of one's comfort. It was in the quiet burden of carrying the past with you, a weight that never quite left. And the road ahead? It was no longer just about getting from one place to another. It was about something much bigger, something Jake hadn't fully understood yet. But he would.